It was supposed to be their honeymoon. Joe DiMaggio and Marilyn Monroe, newlyweds, flying to Japan in February 1954 for what should have been the most romantic trip of their lives. Joe had arranged everything. 2 weeks in Tokyo, away from Hollywood, away from the cameras, just the two of them finally alone together. But when their plane landed, there were 10,000 people waiting at the airport. Not for Joe DiMaggio, the greatest living baseball player. For Marilyn Monroe, the blonde movie star who'd married him 9 days earlier. And standing in that crowd, watching his wife mobbed by fans while he stood forgotten beside her, Joe DiMaggio felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't going to be a honeymoon. This was going to be the beginning of the end. The marriage was already fragile. Joe and Marilyn had dated on and off for 2 years before finally marrying at San Francisco City Hall on January 14th, 1954. The wedding was so rushed, so private, that most of Hollywood didn't even know it was happening. Joe wanted it that way. He was intensely private, uncomfortable with fame despite his own legendary status. He'd fallen in love with Marilyn, or at least with the version of her he'd constructed in his mind. Sweet, feminine, domestic, someone who'd be content being Mrs. DiMaggio and leaving the spotlight behind. Marilyn had fallen in love with Joe too, but for different reasons. He was safe, stable, the opposite of Hollywood, a real man, not an actor or a director or a producer who wanted something from her. She thought maybe if she married him, she could finally feel protected, finally feel like someone valued her for more than her body. But neither of them understood what they were actually getting into. Joe couldn't comprehend that Marilyn Monroe, the movie star, wasn't a role his wife could just quit playing. Marilyn couldn't comprehend that Joe's love came with conditions, the biggest being that she'd have to stop being Marilyn Monroe for the public and become just Marilyn for him. These incompatibilities were obvious to everyone who knew them, but love has a way of making people ignore obvious problems. So they got married. And 9 days later, they flew to Japan, hoping 2 weeks alone would somehow make everything work. The plan was simple. Joe was traveling to Japan on business. He'd been hired to do some baseball coaching and promotional work. Marilyn would come along, they'd explore Tokyo together, have dinners, see the sights, be newlyweds. But what Joe didn't account for was that Marilyn Monroe in 1954 was at the absolute peak of her fame. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes had been released the previous year and made her a global icon. How to Marry a Millionaire had cemented her status. She wasn't just famous in America. She was famous everywhere, including Japan. When their plane touched down at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, the crowd was massive. Japanese fans had been waiting for hours to catch a glimpse of Marilyn Monroe. Police had to form barriers. Photographers climbed on top of cars. People were screaming her name. And Joe, walking beside his wife, realized with growing horror that he was invisible. Nobody was looking at him. Nobody was shouting his name. All eyes were on Marilyn, and she, despite looking exhausted from the long flight, was smiling and waving, slipping into Marilyn Monroe mode automatically, giving the crowd what they wanted. Joe's face in the photographs from that airport arrival tells the whole story. He looked stunned, uncomfortable, angry. This was supposed to be their honeymoon, their private time, and instead, it was a circus. Marilyn's publicist was there. Studio representatives were there. The American military was there, with a request that would change everything. Would Marilyn consider performing for U.S. troops stationed in Korea? Just a few shows. It would mean so much to the soldiers. It would be a brief detour, barely disrupting the honeymoon. Marilyn looked at Joe. Joe looked at Marilyn. And in that moment, their entire marriage hung in the balance. Joe wanted her to say no. This was their honeymoon. The troops could find another entertainer. They had 2 weeks together, and he didn't want to share her with anyone, especially not with thousands of soldiers who'd be looking at his wife the way men always looked at Marilyn Monroe. But Marilyn couldn't say no. These were American troops, far from home, fighting in the aftermath of the Korean War. If she could bring them some happiness, some escape from the misery of military service, how could she refuse? She said yes. Joe's jaw tightened. He didn't argue, Not there, not in front of everyone. But the damage was done. The honeymoon was over before it had really begun. Marilyn would fly to Korea to perform for the troops. Joe would stay in Japan, alone, doing his baseball coaching work, waiting for his wife to return from entertaining thousands of men who desired her. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Their marriage. Right from the start, with Marilyn choosing her career, and her public over her husband and their private life. Wait until you hear what happened in Korea, because what Marilyn experienced there became one of the defining moments of her life, and one of the nails in the coffin of her marriage to Joe DiMaggio. She flew to Korea on February 16, 1954, just 2 days after arriving in Japan. She was exhausted, hadn't unpacked, hadn't adjusted to the time difference. But the moment she stepped off that military plane and saw the soldiers waiting for her, something ignited inside her. These men weren't Hollywood executives judging her acting ability. They weren't critics calling her a dumb blonde. They were young American men, far from home, who just wanted to see a beautiful woman and forget about war for a little while. And Marilyn could give them that. She performed 10 shows in 4 days. 10 shows. Standing on makeshift stages in freezing February weather, wearing a tight purple sequined dress that was completely inappropriate for the cold, singing and dancing for crowds of soldiers who went absolutely wild. The first show was for 17,000 men. The second was for 13,000. By the fourth show, she was performing for audiences of over 25,000. The final show at a U.S. Air Force base drew an estimated 100,000 people. 100,000 soldiers in the freezing cold, packed together, roaring with approval every time Marilyn Monroe moved or sang or smiled. The performances themselves were electric. Marilyn sang, "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend," "Somebody Loves Me," and other songs from her films. But it wasn't about the quality of her voice or the sophistication of the choreography. It was about presence, about the fact that Marilyn Monroe, the Marilyn Monroe, was there, in Korea, in the cold, performing for them. Between songs, she'd talk to the crowd, her voice barely audible over the roar of appreciation. "You guys are wonderful," she'd say, and they'd go wild. A simple statement, but coming from her, it meant everything. Military officials who organized the shows later reported they'd never seen anything like it. The response wasn't just enthusiasm, it was bordering on mania. Soldiers who'd been through hell, who'd seen combat, who'd watched friends die, were crying because Marilyn Monroe smiled at them. The power of her presence was almost frightening in its intensity. She wasn't just entertaining them. She was giving them something to believe in again. Beauty, home, normalcy, hope. All packaged in a purple sequined dress and a platinum blonde smile. There were moments of genuine danger. The crowds pressed forward so aggressively that military police had to form human barriers to keep Marilyn from being crushed. At one show, the stage collapsed under the weight of soldiers trying to get closer. Marilyn kept performing, kept smiling, kept giving them what they needed even as the situation bordered on chaos. Her dedication was remarkable. Her courage was remarkable. And Joe, reading about it in newspapers thousands of miles away, saw only one thing. His wife, his beautiful wife, being devoured by the desire of 100,000 men. Marilyn later said those 4 days in Korea were the happiest of her life. Not her wedding. Not her honeymoon. The 4 days entertaining troops. She felt for the first time genuinely loved and appreciated by an audience that wanted nothing from her except her presence. They didn't care if she could act. They didn't care if she was late or difficult or insecure. They just loved her, simply and completely, for being Marilyn Monroe. She fed off that energy. Performed through illness. She caught a respiratory infection but kept going. Performed through exhaustion. Performed through freezing temperatures that left her shivering between shows. She'd never felt more alive. Meanwhile, back in Japan, Joe DiMaggio sat alone in their hotel room, reading newspaper accounts of his wife's performances. The headlines weren't about their honeymoon or their marriage. They were about Marilyn Monroe, sex symbol, entertaining troops. There were photographs of Marilyn on stage, surrounded by thousands of cheering men. Photographs of soldiers reaching toward her, desperate to touch her, to be close to her. Photographs of his wife, the woman he'd married 9 days earlier, performing sexuality for masses of men who desired her. And Joe, sitting alone thousands of miles away, felt humiliated. The hotel room felt enormous and empty. Joe had been in hundreds of hotel rooms during his baseball career, but this one felt different. This was supposed to be his honeymoon suite. There should have been champagne, room service for 2, laughter, intimacy. Instead, there was just Joe, alone, staring at photographs of his wife being adored by other men. He tried to focus on his own work, the baseball coaching sessions he was supposed to be doing, but his mind kept drifting back to Korea, imagining what was happening, torturing himself with images of Marilyn on stage, Marilyn smiling at soldiers, Marilyn being everything for them that she couldn't seem to be for him in private. Friends who saw Joe during those days said he was quiet, withdrawn, his famous temper barely contained. He'd go through the motions of his coaching obligations, but his heart wasn't in it. How could it be? His wife was in another country, performing for 100,000 men, and he was supposed to smile and teach baseball? The absurdity of it gnawed at him. This wasn't what marriage was supposed to be. This wasn't what he'd signed up for when he proposed to Marilyn. He'd thought, naively it turned out, that marriage would mean she'd retire from the spotlight, or at least scale back. He'd thought she'd want to be Mrs. DiMaggio more than she'd want to be Marilyn Monroe. He'd been wrong. When Marilyn finally returned to Japan, she was glowing. She couldn't stop talking about the experience. How incredible it had been. How the soldiers had loved her. How she'd never felt such genuine appreciation. She was babbling with excitement, barely noticing that Joe was silent, his face stony. She tried to share her joy with him. "Joe, you should have seen it. There were 100,000 men, and they were all there for me." Not understanding that every word was a knife in his pride, Joe finally exploded. This was supposed to be their honeymoon, their time together, and she'd abandoned him to perform for 100,000 men who wanted to sleep with her. She'd chosen them over him. She'd chosen her career, her fame, her need for validation from strangers over building a marriage with him. Marilyn was shocked by his anger. She'd done something good. She'd entertained troops, boosted morale, represented America. How could he be mad about that? But Joe wasn't mad about the principle. He was mad about what it revealed, that Marilyn would always choose being Marilyn Monroe over being Mrs. DiMaggio, that her need for public adoration was stronger than her commitment to their private life, that he'd married a woman who wouldn't stop being a movie star long enough to be his wife. The fight that night in their Tokyo hotel room was vicious. Joe's Italian temper, usually controlled, erupted. Marilyn cried. They both said things they couldn't take back. "I did this for my country," Marilyn shouted through tears. "Those men needed me. I needed you," Joe shouted back. "I'm your husband. This was supposed to be our honeymoon. But you don't care about that. You care about applause. You care about being adored by strangers more than you care about being loved by me? That's not fair," Marilyn sobbed. "You know that's not true. I love you, Joe. But I can't stop being who I am. I can't stop being Marilyn Monroe just because it makes you uncomfortable." "Then maybe you shouldn't have gotten married," Joe said coldly. And there it was, the fundamental truth that would destroy them. Marriage and Marilyn Monroe were incompatible. Joe wanted a wife. Marilyn couldn't stop being a star, and neither of them knew how to bridge that gap. The remaining days of the honeymoon were tense and miserable. They went through the motions, visited temples, had dinners, smiled for photographs when necessary. But the warmth was gone. Joe was sulking, feeling emasculated by his wife's fame and his own invisibility beside her. Marilyn was confused and hurt, unable to understand why Joe couldn't be happy for her success, why he saw her performances for the troops as a betrayal rather than an honor. The cultural divide between them was massive. Joe came from an era and a culture where wives were supposed to support their husbands and fade into the background. Marilyn came from a career and an industry where she was the star, where her name was bigger than anyone's, where she'd fought too hard to get attention to willingly give it up. There's a particular photograph from that Japan trip that captures everything. Joe and Marilyn at a restaurant sitting across from each other. Marilyn is looking at Joe with an expression that's part pleading, part frustrated, trying to make him understand something. Joe is looking away, jaw set, refusing to meet her eyes. The body language says everything. Two people who love each other but can't bridge the gap between what they want and what they're willing to give. The photograph could be captioned, "A marriage ending in real time." The Japan trip also revealed another fundamental problem. Marilyn was addicted to the validation that came from public adoration. It wasn't just ego or vanity. It was something deeper, something rooted in her childhood of abandonment and neglect. When 100,000 soldiers cheered for her, she felt valuable, wanted, loved in a way that one man's private devotion couldn't match. Joe's love was intense but conditional, contingent on her being the woman he wanted her to be. The soldiers' love was unconditional. They loved Marilyn Monroe exactly as she was, performing, sexy, public. She needed that. More than she needed Joe's approval, and Joe couldn't compete with 100,000 men. When they returned to the United States in late February, the marriage was already effectively over. It would limp along for another 9 months before the official divorce in October 1954, but Japan had exposed the cracks that couldn't be repaired. Joe tried to control her more after that trip, objected to her costumes, her film roles, her public appearances. The famous subway grate scene from The 7-Year Itch, filmed in September 1954, was the final straw. Marilyn standing over a subway grate while air blew her white dress up, thousands of onlookers watching, photographers capturing every moment. It was Korea all over again. Marilyn performing for the masses while Joe watched from the sidelines, humiliated and furious. The divorce, when it came, surprised nobody who'd been paying attention. Marilyn cited mental cruelty, which was Hollywood code for irreconcilable differences. Joe never remarried. For the rest of his life, friends said he remained in love with Marilyn, or at least in love with the woman he'd thought she could become if she'd just stopped being a movie star. He never got over the loss, which makes the Japan trip even more tragic. If he'd been able to celebrate her success in Korea, if he'd understood that her need for public validation wasn't about him, maybe the marriage could have survived. But Joe couldn't separate his ego from his love. He needed to be the most important person in Marilyn's life, and he never was. He never could be. Marilyn Monroe was the most important person in Marilyn's life, because if she stopped performing, stopped being the star, stopped getting validation from crowds, she'd have to face the abandoned child inside who believed she was worthless. Joe couldn't fix that. 100,000 soldiers couldn't fix that. But at least the soldiers didn't demand she stop trying. Years later, after Marilyn's death, Joe DiMaggio was asked about the Japan trip. He admitted it had been difficult, admitted he'd been jealous. But he also said, with something like pride, that he'd never seen Marilyn happier than when she came back from performing for those troops. She'd glowed. She'd been alive in a way he'd rarely seen. And even though it had destroyed their honeymoon, and maybe contributed to destroying their marriage, he couldn't entirely begrudge her that happiness. It was one of the most generous things Joe ever said about Marilyn, and one of the saddest, an admission that the woman he loved was most herself when she was performing for strangers, not when she was alone with him. The Japan trip story reveals something important about fame and relationships. They're often incompatible. Fame requires constant performance, constant availability to the public, constant feeding of the hunger for validation. Intimate relationships require privacy, vulnerability, the dropping of performance. Marilyn couldn't drop the performance. Maybe because she'd been performing since childhood, performing happiness when she was miserable, performing confidence when she was terrified, performing Marilyn Monroe when she was really Norma Jean. She'd performed so long that she didn't know how to stop. And Joe wanted the unperformed version of her, the private woman behind the public image. But that woman was so wounded, so needy, so convinced of her own worthlessness that Marilyn kept her locked away even from herself. So Joe got the performance too, and eventually he got tired of it. There's also something to be said about the soldiers' perspective. For them, Marilyn's visit was a gift, a moment of beauty and normalcy in the midst of war and hardship. They weren't thinking about her marriage or her insecurities or the cost of her fame. They just saw a beautiful woman who'd chosen to come entertain them when she could have been anywhere else in the world. To them, she was generous, patriotic, kind. They loved her for it. And Marilyn, who'd spent her life being told she was stupid and being valued only for her body, felt appreciated in a way that actually mattered. These men didn't care if she could recite Shakespeare. They just cared that she showed up. Sometimes that kind of simple appreciation is more powerful than any amount of critical acclaim. The photographs from the Korea performances are extraordinary. Marilyn in that purple sequined dress, microphone in hand, surrounded by a sea of soldiers in military uniforms. You can see the joy on her face, the energy, the aliveness. These aren't the carefully constructed photographs from Hollywood shoots. These are raw, real moments of a woman feeling genuinely happy. Contrast those with the photographs from later in the Japan trip, where Marilyn and Joe are together but distant, and the tragedy becomes clear. She was happy with 100,000 strangers. She was miserable with her husband. What does that say about their marriage? What does that say about Marilyn? Some biographers have argued that if Joe had gone to Korea with Marilyn, if he'd stood beside her during those performances and seen firsthand how much it meant to her and to the troops, maybe he would have understood. Maybe he would have been able to separate his jealousy from his love. But Joe chose to stay behind, chose to sulk in the hotel, chose to read about it secondhand, and imagine the worst. He made himself the victim of her success. And Marilyn, who'd grown up walking on eggshells around people's moods, who'd spent her childhood trying to be good enough to be kept by foster families, couldn't handle Joe's disapproval. She tried to please him by minimizing her achievement. "It wasn't that big a deal," she'd say, even though it clearly was. "I just sang a few songs." But Joe's resentment had already calcified. He'd been diminished by her success, and he couldn't forgive her for it. The cruel irony is that Marilyn genuinely loved Joe. She loved his stability, his protection, his strength. She wanted to be Mrs. DiMaggio. She wanted the domestic life he offered. But she wanted it in addition to her career, not instead of it. Joe wanted either or. Marilyn wanted both. And that fundamental difference, Joe's need for her to choose, Marilyn's need to have everything, was irreconcilable. And it came to a head on their honeymoon, on a trip that should have been about their love, but became about her career. After the divorce, Marilyn would try marriage 2 more times, to Arthur Miller, to whom she was intellectually attracted, but with whom she felt inadequate, and then no one else, though she died hoping to remarry Joe. Joe, for his part, never stopped loving her, but also never stopped wanting her to be someone she wasn't. When Marilyn died in 1962, Joe organized her funeral, banned Hollywood, sent roses to her grave for 20 years. He loved her. But he loved her on his terms, and Marilyn Monroe's life wasn't lived on anyone's terms but her own and the public's. That's what the Japan trip proved. That's what ended their marriage. And that's what, maybe, killed her in the end. The need to be loved by millions was stronger than the need to be loved by one. And you can't build a marriage on that math. Looking back at the Japan-Korea trip now, it's easy to see it as the beginning of the end. But at the time, both Joe and Marilyn probably thought they could get past it. They probably told themselves it was just a rough patch, just a misunderstanding, just an adjustment to married life. But the truth was there in Tokyo. They wanted different things. Joe wanted a wife who'd retire from public life and be content being Mrs. DiMaggio. Marilyn wanted a husband who'd celebrate her fame and support her career. Neither was wrong, but they were wrong for each other. And their honeymoon in Japan, which should have been the happiest time of their marriage, became the moment when they both realized, even if they didn't admit it yet, that this wasn't going to work. The soldiers in Korea didn't know they were watching a marriage dissolve. They just knew they were seeing Marilyn Monroe, and it was the best thing that had happened to them in months. Marilyn didn't know she was choosing between her marriage and her career. She just knew she was doing something that made her feel valued and alive. And Joe didn't know he was destroying his marriage with his jealousy. He just knew he felt humiliated and angry and betrayed. None of them could see the bigger picture. None of them understood that this honeymoon in Japan, this detour to Korea, this moment of Marilyn performing for 100,000 soldiers while her husband sat alone in a hotel room was the beginning of an ending that would take another 8 years to complete. The 8 years between their divorce in 1954 and Marilyn's death in 1962, years in which Joe never stopped loving her and never stopped wanting her to be someone else. The Japan trip is one of those moments where you can see everything about a person and a relationship compressed into a few days. Marilyn's need for validation, Joe's need for control, the impossibility of their union, the tragedy of two people who loved each other but couldn't make it work because they wanted fundamentally different things from life and from each other, and all of it played out on what was supposed to be the most romantic trip of their lives, their honeymoon, which became a wake for their marriage, held in Japan while Marilyn sang for soldiers in Korea, and Joe sat alone wondering how his wife could be so close and yet so impossibly far away. The saddest part is that both of them were right. Joe was right that Marilyn's fame made intimacy impossible. Marilyn was right that she couldn't simply stop being who she was to make him comfortable. They were both right, and they were both wrong. And there was no solution except the one they eventually found. Divorce, followed by years of Joe loving Marilyn from a distance, sending roses to her grave, remaining devoted to the woman he'd lost because he couldn't accept who she actually was. Which city are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments below. Now we want to hear from you. Can fame and intimacy coexist? Would you have chosen differently if you were Marilyn or Joe? How do you balance personal relationships with career ambitions? When is compromise sacrifice? And when is it necessary? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this story moved you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Boulevard of Monroe for more stories about the impossible. Choices of fame, the price of being a legend, and the human cost of living in the spotlight. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next story.